The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the ballroom as executives and their families mingled beneath them, champagne flutes catching the light like scattered diamonds. At the company's annual holiday party, the CEO's grandfather sat in his wheelchair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the December snow fall silently over the city skyline. The old man's hands rested on his lap, his eyes tracking the movement of lips he couldn't hear, conversations he couldn't join. People passed him with polite nods, their smiles tight and brief before they turned away. The CEO himself was across the room, surrounded by board members, his attention consumed by the usual orbit of power and influence. No one noticed when the company driver, Marcus, a quiet man in his early 40s who usually remained invisible in his uniform, set down his plate and walked toward the isolated figure by the window. Marcus had driven the grandfather to the party. That evening had seen the way the old man's face fell when they entered the crowded ballroom, the way his shoulders curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller. Now Marcus stood before him and began to move his hands in fluid, deliberate gestures. The grandfather's eyes widened, then filled with something close to disbelief. He signed back, tentatively at first, then with growing animation. Marcus smiled and pulled up a chair. Within moments, the two were deep in conversation, hands dancing through the air, faces alive with expression. And slowly, the room began to notice. The transformation happened in stages, like watching a photograph develop. First, a few curious glances. Then someone paused mid-conversation to watch. Then another. The energy in the room shifted, curiosity rippling outward from the corner where the driver and the deaf grandfather were engaged in what was clearly an animated discussion. The grandfather was laughing now, his whole face transformed, signing with such enthusiasm that his wheelchair shifted slightly with each gesture. Marcus matched his energy, sometimes pausing to fingerspell a word, other times using broader signs that seemed to paint pictures in the air. It was beautiful to watch, this silent conversation that somehow spoke louder than all the chatter around them. Sarah Chen, the company's VP of Operations, was the first to approach. She'd been with the firm for 15 years and had seen the grandfather at perhaps a dozen company events, always sitting alone, always departing early. She stood a few feet away, not wanting to interrupt but clearly interested. When Marcus noticed her, he didn't stop signing. Instead, he included her with a glance and a gesture toward an empty chair. Sarah sat, watching intently as Marcus interpreted, explaining that the grandfather had been telling him about his years. As a machinist, how he'd lost his hearing gradually in his 40s from the factory noise, back before anyone cared much about protection or safety. The grandfather's hands moved with practiced precision as he described the feeling of the machines through the vibration in the floor, how he'd learned to read the rhythm of production through his feet and his eyes when his ears betrayed him. Marcus translated seamlessly, his voice carrying the grandfather's pride and pain in equal measure. Sarah found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed. She'd never known any of this, none of them had. The grandfather had been the CEO's father had apparently helped fund the startup capital for the company decades ago, but that history had been reduced to a footnote, a ceremonial presence at holiday parties, a man in a wheelchair who received a respectful nod but never a real conversation. More people began to gather, James from accounting, Rita from human resources, even some of the younger staff who'd been more interested in the open bar than the networking opportunities. They formed a loose circle, and Marcus found himself interpreting not just for the grandfather, but facilitating a real conversation. Multiple people asking questions, the grandfather responding with the kind of stories that come from someone who's been storing them up, waiting for someone to care enough to ask. He talked about the early days of the company, about his son, the CEO's father who'd had the vision but not the capital, about the risks they'd taken, the near bankruptcy, the first major contract that had saved everything. Across the room, Jonathan Pierce, the CEO, finally noticed the unusual gathering. He'd been in the middle of discussing quarterly projections with the CFO when he registered the crowd forming near the windows. At first, he felt a flash of annoyance, wondering what spectacle was drawing attention from the carefully orchestrated networking he'd planned for this evening. Then he saw his grandfather at the center of it, saw the animation in the old man's face, saw his hands moving in ways Jonathan had never bothered to learn to understand. And he saw Marcus, the driver, the man Jonathan barely registered beyond, making sure his car was ready when needed, serving as the bridge between his grandfather and the world. Jonathan set down his drink and began moving through the crowd, his CFO trailing behind him with a puzzled expression. As he got closer, he could hear Marcus's voice, could see how the staff were genuinely engaged, laughing at something the grandfather had signed, asking follow-up questions that Marcus translated with easy fluency. Jonathan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Shame, maybe, or regret. He couldn't quite name it, but it sat heavy and cold beneath his ribcage. He stood at the edge of the circle for several minutes, unnoticed or perhaps deliberately unacknowledged. His grandfather was in the middle of a story about the first time he'd met Jonathan's grandmother, signing with such expressiveness that even without understanding the language, Jonathan could sense the romance and humor in the tale. Marcus's interpretation brought it to life, and Jonathan found himself genuinely curious about a story he'd never heard, about a courtship that had happened decades before his birth, but had led to everything, to everyone, including him. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, Marcus glanced up and met Jonathan's eyes. Something passed between them, unspoken but clear. Marcus signed something to the grandfather, who turned his wheelchair slightly and locked eyes with his grandson. The old man's expression shifted, became more guarded, the openness of moments before shuttered, behind something that looked painfully like resignation. He knew this pattern too well, Jonathan realized. The brief attention followed by the inevitable. Retreat, the polite excuse, the return to isolation. But Jonathan didn't walk away. Instead, he stepped forward into the circle. "I didn't know you could sign," he said to Marcus, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended, thick with emotions he couldn't quite process. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I learned in college, sir. My sister is deaf." It seemed important. Jonathan nodded slowly, then looked at his grandfather. The old man's hands were still now resting on the arms of his wheelchair. The joy that had animated his face minutes ago had dimmed, and Jonathan felt the weight of that dimming like a physical thing. "What was he saying?" Jonathan asked. "About my grandmother?" Marcus glanced at the grandfather, who gave a small nod. He was talking about the first time they'd danced. How she didn't care that he couldn't hear the music. How she just held him and let him feel the rhythm through her. How that was the moment he knew he'd found something rare. The circle had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now, the CEO and his grandfather, and the driver who'd somehow become the most important person in the room. Jonathan felt the eyes on him, felt the weight of his own failure pressing down. How many years had it been? How many events where his grandfather had sat alone while Jonathan networked and schmoozed and built his empire, never once thinking to build a bridge to the man who'd helped make it all possible. "Can you teach me?" Jonathan asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "To sign? I should have learned years ago. I should have—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to articulate the full scope of his neglect. The grandfather's eyes widened. He signed something quick and sharp, and Marcus hesitated before translating. "He says it's a lot of work, that it takes time and commitment. He is asking if you're serious." Jonathan looked directly at his grandfather, held that gaze even though it hurt, even though he could see decades of disappointment reflected back at him. "I'm serious," he said. "I'm sorry it took me this long. I'm sorry I've been such a—" He stopped again, shook his head. "Yes, I'm serious. Please?" The grandfather studied him for a long moment, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, deliberately, the old man lifted his hands and began to sign. His movements were careful, exaggerated slightly, clearly demonstrative. Marcus spoke alongside him. This is grandfather. This is grandson. This is love. These are the important ones. Start with these. Jonathan watched intently, his own hands, coming up to mimic the gestures, feeling clumsy and inadequate, but trying anyway. His grandfather corrected his hand position, gentle but firm, and Jonathan felt the first real physical connection they'd had in years, maybe decades. Around them, others began to ask questions too. Sarah wanted to know how to sign thank you. James asked about hello and goodbye. What had started as one driver's act of kindness was becoming something larger, something that felt like it might actually change things. The party continued, but the energy had shifted. The grandfather remained the center of attention, no longer ignored but sought out. And Marcus stayed close, interpreting, facilitating, making sure the old man could participate in conversations that ranged from company history to current events to personal stories. Someone brought the grandfather a plate of food, actually asking what he wanted rather than assuming. Someone else pulled up the photo slideshow meant to play on loop on the wall screens. And the grandfather identified people and moments from the company's history that even longtime employees didn't know. Stories that Marcus translated with increasing animation. Jonathan stayed throughout all of it, rarely leaving his grandfather's side, trying to absorb not just the basic signs Marcus was teaching him, but the deeper lesson about presence, about seeing the people you claim to value. He watched how Marcus engaged with his grandfather as a complete person, not a disability or an obligation. How he laughed at the old man's jokes, asked genuine questions, created space for him to be fully himself. It was a master class in human decency, being taught by a man Jonathan had never properly seen. As the evening wound down and people began to drift toward the coat check, Jonathan asked Marcus to stay for a moment. The grandfather had been taken to the restroom by one of the venue staff who'd quickly learned some basic signs from Marcus's impromptu lessons. Jonathan and Marcus stood near the windows where this had all started, looking out at the snow that was falling heavier now, blanketing the city in white. "I need to make this right," Jonathan said. "Not just learning to sign, though we'll do that, but I need to make sure this doesn't happen again. That we're not a company that ignores people, that makes anyone feel invisible." He turned to look at Marcus. "I've been thinking. We should have sign language classes available. For staff, for family members, and I want to audit our accessibility. All of it, offices, events, communications. I want your help with that if you're willing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sir, I'm a driver." "You're a person who saw another person being excluded and did something about it," Jonathan corrected. "You're someone who has skills and insights we clearly need. I'm not saying quit driving if you don't want to, but I am saying I'd like to create a position, Director of Accessibility and Inclusion, and I can't think of anyone better qualified." He paused. There'd be a substantial raise, obviously, and real authority to make changes. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but Marcus?" Jonathan waited until the other man met his eyes. "Thank you. For tonight. For seeing my grandfather. For being better than the rest of us." Marcus shook his head slightly. "I just did what anyone should do." "Your grandfather is interesting, funny, sharp as hell. He's been sitting in rooms full of people for years, and all any of us had to do was learn to listen in a different way." He glanced toward where the grandfather was being wheeled back by the staff member, who was carefully signing something that made the old man smile. "The world's not built for people like him, or my sister, but it could be." "That's the thing. It could be if people just cared enough to try." Jonathan nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. His grandfather returned, and Jonathan helped him with his coat, taking his time, making sure he was warm enough for the cold outside. As they prepared to leave, Sarah Chen approached, her phone in her hand. "I've been researching," she said, "ASL classes in the area. There's an intensive weekend course starting next month. I signed up. I thought maybe others might want to join." She looked at Jonathan, then at several other staff members who were lingering nearby. "We could go together. Make it a team thing." By the time they left the venue, a group text had been started. 12 people committing to the classes, more saying they'd look into online options. The grandfather signed something to Marcus, who smiled and translated for Jonathan. He says this is the best company party he's ever attended. He wants to know if you're all going to actually follow through, or if this is just guilt talking. Jonathan looked at his grandfather, at the challenge in those old eyes, and he signed the one thing Marcus had taught him carefully earlier in the evening, his hands forming the gesture for love with deliberate care. The grandfather's expression softened. He signed something back, and Marcus' voice grew quiet as he interpreted. He says that's a start, but love is a verb, not just a feeling. He'll be watching to see what you do next. The drive home was quiet, the grandfather dozing in the back seat while snow accumulated on the windshield. Jonathan sat in the passenger seat instead of the back, watching Marcus navigate the slick streets with careful competence. "You didn't have to do this tonight," Jonathan said finally. "You could have just driven him here and picked him up later. You didn't have to stay, didn't have to engage." Marcus shrugged, his eyes on the road. "My sister spent years being the person everyone talked around instead of talking to. I saw what that did to her, how it made her feel less than invisible. When I saw your grandfather sitting there, same thing happening, he paused. I couldn't walk past that, not when I could do something about it." Jonathan was quiet, thinking about all the times he had walked past it. Years of walking past it. "I'm going to be better," he said, and it sounded like a promise or maybe a prayer. Not just at signing, at all of it, at seeing people, at being the kind of leader who creates a culture where what you did tonight isn't extraordinary, it's just normal. Marcus glanced at him briefly before returning his attention to the road. "Then I guess I'll think seriously about that job offer. Because if you mean that, if you really want to change things, I know how. I've been watching companies fail at accessibility for years. I know what works and what's just performative nonsense, and I'd like to be part of actually getting it right." They pulled up to the grandfather's assisted living facility, and Jonathan helped wheel him inside, signing a clumsy goodnight that made the old man smile despite its imperfection. In the warm lobby, as staff came to help the grandfather to his room, Jonathan signed one more thing, the gesture for tomorrow, then pointed to himself and his grandfather. A question and a promise. The grandfather studied him for a long moment, then nodded and signed back. Marcus, standing nearby, translated. He says he'll see you tomorrow, and he'll hold you to it. The next morning, Jonathan woke early and immediately pulled up ASL learning resources on his tablet. He practiced basic signs over coffee, feeling ridiculous and determined in equal measure. He called Marcus before 9. "I'm serious about that position, Director of Accessibility and Inclusion. I want to start making changes immediately. Can you meet this week to discuss what that would look like?" Marcos's voice on the other end of the line was cautious but interested. "I can do that. But, sir, real change isn't quick. It's not a PR move. It's infrastructure, training, cultural shift. It takes time and money and a willingness to be uncomfortable." "I know," Jonathan said, "or I'm starting to know. I'm ready to be uncomfortable. I'm ready to do the work." They met that Thursday in Jonathan's office, and Marcus came prepared with a presentation that was both impressive and damning. He walked Jonathan through every way the company currently failed at accessibility. The website wasn't compatible with screen readers. Company videos had no captions. The office building had wheelchair ramps but no visual alert systems for fire alarms. Job postings used language that actively discouraged disabled applicants. The health insurance plan had massive gaps in coverage for assistive devices. The list went on, and Jonathan felt his shame deepen with each slide. "This is going to cost money," Marcus said bluntly. "Real money, and it's going to require buy-in from every department. HR, IT, facilities, communications. You're going to have people push back, say it's not necessary, that it's too expensive. You need to be ready for that." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Put together a comprehensive plan. Full audit, recommended changes, budget projections. He'll present it to the board next month. And Marcus, I want you there with me. This needs to be a priority, and it needs your voice, not just mine." Over the following weeks, Jonathan kept his promise to his grandfather, visiting 3 times a week, practicing signs, slowly building not just a vocabulary but a real relationship. The old man was patient with his mistakes, but didn't coddle him. He pushed Jonathan to be better, to try harder, to not give up when it got frustrating. And through their conversations, Jonathan learned things about his family history, about his father, about the early days of the company, that no one had ever told him because no one had ever asked his grandfather. The old man had stories, insights, wisdom earned through decades of experience, and it had all been sitting there, unheard, because no one had been willing to learn his language. The sign language classes started, and Jonathan attended every session alongside Sarah, James, Rita, and 9 others from the company. They were terrible at first, fumbling through basic alphabet and common phrases, but they kept showing up. Marcus sometimes joined them, offering tips, correcting their grammar, encouraging their progress. It became a bonding experience, this shared learning, this collective acknowledgement that they'd been failing at something important. The board presentation was tense. Jonathan presented Marcus's comprehensive accessibility plan, complete with budget projections that made the CFO wince. There were questions, pushback, concerns about costs and necessity. But Jonathan held firm, and he brought his grandfather to the meeting. Through Marcus's interpretation, the old man told the board about decades of being excluded, about watching the company he'd helped build treat him like a prop rather than a person. He challenged them to do better, to build a company that didn't just tolerate difference, but actively embraced it. The board approved the plan, though not without stripping some elements due to budget concerns. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Marcus officially accepted the director position and began the long work of institutional change. Website remediation, staff training, infrastructure improvements, partnership with disability advocacy organizations, recruitment initiatives aimed at disabled candidates. It was slow, sometimes frustrating work, but it was work that mattered. 6 months after that company party, the firm held another event, this one specifically designed with accessibility in mind. There were sign language interpreters stationed throughout the venue. All speeches were captioned in real time on screens. The space was fully wheelchair accessible with clear pathways and appropriate seating. The lighting was designed to be comfortable for people with sensory sensitivities. The food options were clearly labeled for various dietary restrictions and allergies. Jonathan's grandfather attended, and this time he wasn't sitting alone by the windows. He was surrounded by people who could now sign at least basic greetings and questions, who'd taken the time to learn, who saw him as the complete person he'd always been. Jonathan watched his grandfather laugh at something Sarah signed, watched him tell a story to a group of younger employees who listened with genuine interest, and he felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of regret and shame beginning to ease. Marcus found him standing on the edge of the crowd. "Good turnout," Marcus said. "And everyone's actually using the accommodations. That's the real test. You can have all the infrastructure in the world, but if people don't use it, if they don't actually care, it's all just expensive window dressing." Jonathan nodded. "We still have a long way to go. I know that. But this feels different, better, real." "It is real," Marcus agreed. "You followed through." "That's rare," he paused. "Your grandfather told me something yesterday. He said for the first time in 20 years, he's actually proud to tell people his grandson runs this company. That what you're building now is something worth being associated with." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. He looked across the room at his grandfather, at the old man who'd been invisible for so long, who was now central and valued and seen. "I almost let him disappear," Jonathan said quietly. "I almost let years pass without ever really knowing him. If you hadn't stopped that night, if you hadn't taken the time to sign to him, I might have kept walking past him for the rest of his life." Marcus shook his head. "You're giving me too much credit. I just did what should be normal. The real change is what you did after. Anyone can have one good moment. You chose to make it mean something. You chose to keep showing up, keep learning, keep pushing, even when it was hard. That's the part that matters." The party continued, and at some point, someone suggested the grandfather tell the story about the company's founding, about those early, risky days. Marcus interpreted, and the grandfather's signs were large and expressive, his face animated as he described near disasters and unlikely successes. The audience was rapt, and Jonathan recorded it on his phone, wanting to preserve this, wanting to remember the first time his grandfather had really been allowed to be the storyteller he'd always been. As the evening wound down, Jonathan found himself once again standing with his grandfather and Marcus near those same windows where everything had changed. The snow was falling again, the city glittering beneath its white blanket. The grandfather signed something and Marcus translated. He says he's tired but happy, that this is what he always hoped the company could be. Somewhere that saw the value in everyone, that didn't discard people for being different. Jonathan signed a response, slow and careful, his vocabulary still limited but improving. Thank you for waiting, for giving me a chance to be better. The grandfather reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. No signs needed for that, no words necessary, just connection, real and solid, and earned through effort and change. If you've stayed with this story to the end, I hope it's reminded you that small acts of kindness can create ripples that change everything. That it's never too late to learn, to grow, to bridge the gaps we've allowed to form between ourselves and the people we should be seeing. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed this story and share it with someone who might need the reminder that being better is always possible, always worth it, always within reach. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to learn another's language, to see another's value, to stop walking past and start showing up. Be that person. The world needs more people willing to do the work.